All right, you guys talk and I'll switch over.
Okay.
So, Matthew and Lisa.
Hi.
Hi. It's good to see you again.
Yeah.
I have known you for a little while.
Yes.
Known you for a little while.
Not a little over 8 years.
That's right, exactly. So I'm Annette Humberson. I'm the social worker here at the Transplant House. And tonight we're going to talk with Matthew Miller and Lisa Vegas, who are very well known to me and very dear to me, actually. Matthew was a patient who was being evaluated for a liver transplant at the Cleveland Clinic, and I was a social worker there at the Cleveland Clinic. And that's how we met. And we figured out that it was in September of
2014.
2014. And life is very different today.
Wow, thank goodness.
Yeah, thank goodness. Life is very different today. When I met you, you were very, very sick.
Yep.
I don't even remember what your MELD score was at that time. I know what it went up to.
I got up to 38.
So you were coming in for the evaluation. You had been this independent businessman, working hard. Would you say type A personality?
A plus.
Yeah, and you were living in Pittsburgh. Lisa was living here in Cleveland, and you were trying to make this work and knowing you had liver disease, but I don't know that either one of you at that time really understood how sick you were. Although we will talk about why cowboy boots are something that people remember when they talk to you. But I just remember meeting you, and you were not only physically sick, but emotionally. It was a really, really hard time. And you weren't able to work. I think maybe you were struggling trying.
At that point,
I was still working at that point.
it was a consolidation, but it was coming to the end because I couldn't.
Yeah. And Lisa was trying to work,
Yes.
to really support both of you, and this is where it started. And at that time, neither of you really obviously knew how sick you really were, but also what these symptoms meant, what it meant to be a caregiver.
Right.
I mean, the week that he had his evaluation, he came to most of his appointments because you had no idea that would be something that would be helpful to you,
Right.
or him.
And at the time, they didn't really require
No.
the caregiver, the
No.
family member, to be with the patient. And
Yeah.
since he was still driving at the time, I just,
Shouldn't have been right.
yeah. I went to the ones that I was supposed to go to. I met you,
Yes.
right? That was one of the required ones,
Uh-huh.
meeting the social worker and the
Yes.
surgeon.
Yes.
And so I went to all of the ones that I was supposed to go to, but not all of them.
So that was in September. And there were appointments that had to continue to go on after that. And then you got hospitalized in November.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And then by that point, I don't think you were working at all anymore.
No.
And so that meant you had no income, and you were struggling to try to figure out how you were going to pay for your insurance.
Yeah.
Right.
And I remember this one terrible day. There were a lot of hard days, but I remember this one day that I had to call you and say, okay, we have to figure out how to pay your insurance premium.
Yeah.
Because if we don't, you're going to go on hold
Yeah.
on the list. You were already listed at that point. But if we didn't have insurance coverage, and that's when we really started to talk more in depth about the VA.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Thank God you brought it up.
and the fact that the VA, in your case, could be helpful, and you got the insurance, but that's how hard
Yeah.
things were at that
Right.
time.
And that's how little we even knew about,
Mhm.
even thinking about the VA. He'd been out of the military for so
Mhm.
long.
Had
We
no idea.
Had no idea he was eligible for anything.
Exactly, right. And when you're going through that evaluation, I mean, there's so many stories, and I know there's great stories that you include in this presentation, but just really like trying to survive, literally and figuratively.
We also still had, Lisa's son was in college, my son was in college. We were trying to make house payments. I mean, it was frightening what was going on.
And in the meantime, you're getting sicker
Oh, yeah.
and going to the hospital
Right.
and getting treated,
Yep.
and you're trying to understand what's going on. And your mom lived 3 hours away, so no one else was in Cleveland.
No,
It was
we had no
just you.
family.
So trying to figure out how she was going to keep working because you're self-employed also,
Yes.
and get through this. And so finally, you got the VA cleared up, you had your insurance, but then you had dry runs,
Yeah.
which I know you will eventually talk about in the presentation. But April 13th,
2015.
you get called in
Yep.
for your transplant. That was finally the one that happened. After how many dry runs?
4.
Four, so that was the fifth call that we've done.
And can you explain what a dry run is?
Well, a dry run is when they call you from the clinic or the hospital and they tell you to drop everything and, we think we have a liver, come in and wait. And then they'll let us know what's going to happen.
They do tell you, sometimes you can be, particularly us, because we were relatively close, you can be back up. And they'll tell you. I mean, there's really, 3 reasons that you can have a dry run, or at least the way we figured it out. One was they tell you you're the backup, and you come in, and the other person is fine. And they can go through the transplant, so they get transplanted and you don't. It is possible that they could have an infection or they could have something going on, and so they can't be transplanted, so that it be yours. The second one is that you come in and you have some infection or something happening that they weren't aware of, and they can send you home. And then the third reason is that they determine at some point that the liver's not healthy enough to be transplanted. And we had at least one of each of those.
Yes, we do.
Now that can happen in any organ.
In
Any organ,
yeah,
right.
Not
that's
just
just-
liver.
that's- it's
It
not
can
just
happen
liver.
in intestine, your
Right,
heart,
right.
your kidney, your
Any
organ.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So it's to say it's an emotional roller coaster is probably the understatement of the century, because it's just really hard to keep getting yourself up for.
Right.
Exactly.
In the beginning, you are praying that the phone rings, and at one point you're like, not again,
Right. Do I want it to ring?
Yeah.
Is it gonna ring? Is it gonna be real? Is it gonna be real? So you got the transplant and you had so much confusion, which I know you're going to talk about with the hepatic encephalopathy. And even after you had your transplant, it took a while for that to clear up. And so you went home and you slowly started your rehab. And once you started to get a lot better, I remember when you came back into the clinic and you showed me a picture. And it was really the first time that I felt like I met you. Like really that I met you. Because before that, it was like all your energy into survival mode.
Right.
Like that's really
For both
all
of us, right,
you
right.
could really focus on. And one of the things we talked about was all that you felt was missing. And I felt was missing too. And even though I had been a social worker for many years, having taken care of a family member within that same time,
Right.
that you guys were going through that, and then having that family member die, it really, for me, resonated too. In terms of, okay, what do caregivers really do? And that's where this started. And so, we were fortunate that the two of you just were all in. For, to copy the Cleveland Cavaliers, you were all in. And it was shortly after that we started, I can remember it was in January. We were sitting in Albon Pond with a notebook. Having lunch, and we started talking about what we could do. And we started writing these slides, and you started talking to people, and you had met Elaine here at the transplant house, and you came here for coffee for caregivers. And tonight, I'm very excited to have you present the slides that you presented to class every week.
Don't get too excited. I
How many
haven't talked
years?
yet.
Yeah, I know. For how many years did you do that? 3, 4.
Oh, 4.5.
4.5, almost 5 years.
Until COVID.
Yeah.
Right.
And so we just really wanted to put this information together again and have you speak about it. so that we can put it on our website and have it available for people who are staying here or people in the community.
Sure.
Because one of the things, Lisa, that I'll never forget that you said was, even though I didn't need to stay at the transplant house, I needed the support.
Exactly.
And you live how far away from here?
Oh, we lived, what, 4 miles from here at the time in Shaker?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, you lived 4 miles from.
But I didn't know the transplant house existed because as a social worker, you knew we didn't need a place to stay.
Exactly.
And so, like, we didn't even know the transplant house was here.
No.
But one of the things we've talked about and what we want to develop more is for people to have the support no matter where they are.
Right.
Exactly.
So whether they are staying here at the transplant house or they are back at home in Michigan or, you know,
They're local.
who knows? We've had people here from all over the United States. So, yeah, when you said I lived so close to the hospital and yet I never felt so alone. And so our first slide is you are not alone. And I will let you explain what this means.
So,
We came up with this cartoon, talking about a personal caregiver role and all the different hats that someone wears from, you know, you're the nurse, you're the doctor, you know, you're the travel agent, there's just so many things. So that's how we came up with our little cartoon here that shows all the different things that the caregiver role has to do with. But before that, I think, Matthew, you want to.
well, maybe I'll kind of start
Mhm.
to tell our story, because it's clearly our story. This is not my story. I wouldn't have through it. So I'll kind of go back to the beginning. You know, I was diagnosed in 2013, and it kind of hit me like a brick, really. That I had no idea, other than, you know, I guess the best way to put it is I grew up on a farm, and it was a real farm. We didn't grow it, raise it, or shoot it. We didn't eat it, literally. And, you know, I grew up in a world that you had to take care of everybody else. And it was my job. I mean, in fact, you know, as a kid, I didn't even think they made new tractors because everything we bought was broken and we had to fix it. So I grew up being Mr. Fix It. And even as an adult, you know, I always thought it was my job to worry about everybody else. So when I was diagnosed with hemochromatosis, as an example, you know, there were things I was supposed to do, and I just didn't do them. You know, it was like I had to worry about everybody else and take care of everybody else. So it really hit me really hard when it happened and was diagnosed so sick, and you know, and I didn't take care of myself, and I did stupid things, and so I had no idea what was, you know, going to happen at that point. Thankfully, you know, Lisa was there, but we started on that journey then, and you know, I had always thought I was such a tough guy that I could get through anything, and I only mention that because we see that so often in patients, and you know, as I said, I grew up on a farm. In high school and college, I was a wrestler, and I went to the national finals twice. And my first job out of college is I flew B-52 bombers in the United States Air Force. So I thought I can do anything. I can get through it. Well, that, you know, really wasn't the case. So you know, when we started on this journey, it was really a situation where we were not prepared. And fortunately, you know, we learned along the way, but there were some, you know, really hard lessons. So I think probably now is the time for you to start through maybe go to the next slide. But what's the role of the caregiver?
Right. So, and we're talking about a personal caregiver here, not a caregiver in terms of a nurse or a doctor. It's the family member or friend or whoever it is that takes on that responsibility to help someone through transplant. So, you know, the role is very demanding, it's very important, it's rewarding, and in most cases it's required. In order to be listed for transplant, you're going to need to have that person that will stay with you, whether you have to come here to the transplant house to live, or you're lucky like us and lived here in Cleveland already. But, you know, you need to have someone that'll help take care of you. As much as you might not want them to take care of you, and you're going to need someone. And that's something that Matthew learned. And the role sort of changes throughout the journey. Before Matthew's transplant, I felt like I needed to help keep him as healthy and as active as I could. I had to educate myself about his condition and his needs. And, little things like even getting exercise was very difficult for him. But ultimately, I needed to go to all the appointments with Matthew and try to become as knowledgeable and as aware as I could. I don't have a medical degree. I'm a professional ballroom dancer, so if you need to learn how to cha-cha or tango, we're good. But I didn't know anything about liver disease, and I knew nothing about transplant. I'd never even met anyone who had had a transplant. So then my role sort of changed immediately after Matthew's transplant. I had to keep him motivated and following all the rules. I had to learn his routine of medications.
I'm not a rule follower.
He's not a rule follower.
I spent most of my life asking for forgiveness.
So there was that. And then I had to learn his new routine of medications, which was a huge, big deal. It was all these meds at several times a day. And
before transplant, I was taking
like
33 things a day.
Yeah. But all of that changed. After transplant, you throw all of that out and you get this new bucket of medications. You have to try to figure out what, when, and they did a great job of helping with that. But he couldn't do it himself at that time, so I had to do it. And I also was responsible for making sure he had his blood work done, because after transplant, he had to have his labs drawn every week, and then it was every 2 weeks, and now it's once a month. But at the time, he wasn't able to drive, because after the transplant, you're not allowed to drive for like 60 or 90 days, I think. So I literally had to get us out in the morning before his meds at 9 a.m. We had to make sure his blood was drawn so that he could take his meds on time. So that was part of what I did. And then during his recovery, I tried to help us figure out what our new normal was, which was ever changing. And that was, again, it was baby steps, just walking a little bit afterwards and then get stronger. So it was, again, forever changing.
Yeah. And everybody's journey is different.
It is.
I mean, you can have some patients that are walking in a short time, and other patients that are not. Like it just takes them longer. And
depending upon what you're dealing with, time leading up to transplant, some people don't spend a lot of time in the hospital, other people have all kinds of issues.
Right.
I mean, 14 months leading up to transplant, I was in the hospital 271 days. So we lived there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There should be a suite.
There you go.
And so some other jobs that I had during this time, before, during, and after the transplant, I was Matthew's medical aide. I had to help him with his personal care, as we said, learning medications and setting up his pill box. I had to keep track and go to all of his appointments, which is easier now electronically with my chart and all those other things. You can do that. It was important that I monitored his symptoms and kind of kept track of them so that I could help when it came to going to the doctor's office and talking to the doctors, because most of the time Matthew just didn't really remember from day to day how he was feeling. Or he lied. Right. And then I was Matthew's personal trainer. Somewhere along the line, someone had told me that the more active that Matthew could stay leading up to transplant, that would help him to recover faster. So although he didn't want to exercise, I would trick him into getting exercise. We had 4 dogs at the time, and we had a fenced-in yard, so we didn't have to walk them. But I would gather everybody up into the car, and we'd go to the park, and we would walk. And I always picked places that had lots of places for him to sit, because it was mainly me walking the dogs and him sitting on the park bench. But even going from bench to bench and getting in and out of the car at that point was really exercise for you. So, take him to the movies, because then you have to walk down that long hall to get to the movie theater, and then you got to sit for a little bit, and then you have to do the walk again. And I would never drop him off at the door. I would always park a little farther away than I had to. I'd say, we don't want anyone to hit the car, honey.
Yeah.
And then I would bring him in. And so that's how I kind of tricked him. But he was not going to get on a treadmill by himself. He wasn't going to do anything by himself at that point. And then, of course, I was the hall monitor. So it is critical as a caregiver that you are aware of where the patient is and what they're doing at all times. And I did learn this the hard way. This was in the summer of 2014, in August. Matthew actually was still working at the time. He was a consultant at UPMC, which is the big hospital center in Pittsburgh. And although we lived in Cleveland, he would go to work and stay on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and come back on Thursday. So we'd drive to Pittsburgh, work for 2 days, and then come back. And that worked out okay for a while until this one. Yeah, he would stay with his daughter so that I knew he was there with family, and if anything happened, they would contact me. So this one particular Thursday, I got a phone call from Matthew, and he said that he really didn't feel well. He was feeling sick, and I kind of knew what that meant. He was sounding a little bit confused, and I could hear it in his voice that he was not himself. And I said to him, I said, well, look, here's what you're going to do. I want you to call work and let them know that you're not going to be there today. And I want you to stay at Maggie's house until I get there. I have to go into work to cancel all of my lessons. Once I do that, I'll hop on the turnpike and I'll be there, and pick you up. And he said, okay. I said, just rest, just take a nap and rest. And I will call you when I am on the turnpike headed to Pittsburgh. And he said, okay. So I rushed into work, canceled all my appointments, and hopped in the car, and I was headed on the turnpike. So about an hour and a half or so, 1.5 or 2 hours, I called Matthew and said I was on my way. And he said, no. And I knew he wasn't, he sounded funny, and I realized he was on the Bluetooth of his car. And I told him, I said, Matthew, where are you going? What are you doing? And he said, I have to get home. I'm so sick. I have to get home. I'm driving home. And I said, Matthew, you can't drive. At this point, I had known that he had impaired encephalopathy, and he was very confused. I kept asking him where he was. He didn't know what road he was on. But he said it was okay because the GPS was taking him home. That's what he told me. And I said, well, where are you? And he said, I'm going to be fine. I'm only 149 miles from the house. And at that point, I realized, I told him, Maggie only lives 98 miles from our house. You're going the wrong direction. Where are you? Are you on the turnpike? He didn't know. He had no idea where he was. And at that point, he got very angry with me. And he said, just leave me alone. I'm coming home. I'll be home in 149 miles. And he hung up his phone, and then he shut it off, I guess, because he wouldn't answer it. So at that point, I pulled over because I was on the freeway. I pulled over and I did the only thing I could think of doing. I called 911. And I explained to them that I didn't know where he was. And I told them he was sick. It wasn't his fault. And he just was lost. And I was so concerned that he was going to hurt himself or someone else. So they were really, really helpful. The turnpike, the Pennsylvania State Police, they told me that they would, if I filed a missing person report or a lost persons report with my local police department, that they could possibly ping the car. Now, they were able to ping the car. The type of car had GPS, but we hadn't paid for the Embrace service, the extra service in order to do it. So although they could find Matthew, they wouldn't because we hadn't paid for it. I actually tried to call and pay for it on the spot, and they wouldn't let me do that. So, but the state police said, get your local police involved, and if you file a police report, it'll force them to ping the car. So the Shaker Heights Police Department, they were right at my door, and the guy was great. The officer said, okay, Lisa, here's the report, sign it and date it. We'll fill it in later. I just need to enter this number in the computer in my car. So I did that, and he did it. He went back into his cruiser and did all that. And as it turned out, they pinged the car. They had located where they thought Matthew was. And at the time, when they went to see where the car was, although it said the car was there, it was indeed on the turnpike, and it wasn't there. So they kept driving around, pinged the car again. It was the same location. And it was supposedly going east on the turnpike instead of west, which is the way it was supposed to be going. But it wasn't until they got out on foot and they got out of their squad cars and started really trying to find out where he was, that they found him. And as it had turned out, I guess Matthew had lost control of the car and went over an embankment. There were a bunch of rocks, and he lost control of the car and ended up with this car kind of flipped over amongst all of these rocks. And so when they found him, they said that he was awake, that he was not really responsive at all. He wasn't able to talk. He wasn't injured really that they could see, but he was just staring straight forward as if he was in a fog. And, you know, he had no clothes with him. He didn't have his overnight bag with him. He didn't have his, you had your computer with you. It was in the back of the car. His meds, he didn't have his meds. He didn't have anything with him. As a matter of fact, he had on cowboy boots, which he always wore, and no shirt and boxer shorts. That's how he walked out of the house to go drive home. And they were a bit surprised at that, I'm sure. And then, but they got him out of the car and got him to the emergency room, and I got the phone call that they knew where he was, and I hopped in my car for the 5-hour drive to go get him, because that's how far in the wrong direction he had gone.
It was in Altoona, Pennsylvania.
Yep. And the whole time that I was driving there, I had no idea where I was going. Luckily, I had GPS, but I was talking to the emergency room doctor that was taking care of him, and he was great, UPMC. He kept calling me with updates. He said, well, we've x-rayed him. He has no broken bones. Well, we did a CAT scan. Everything looks good there. He basically said, you know, for what he's been through, he's in really good shape. I mean, besides the obvious liver disease, you know, he's really healthy. And he said to me, what do you want me to do with him? Should I admit him? And I said, no, just give him a bunch of lactulose and see what happens. Lactulose is what you have to take to kind of get rid of the ammonia that causes this confusion. So he said, okay, I'll do that. And by the time I got there, Matthew was so upset because he had no memory of what had happened. He had no idea why he was in the hospital. He didn't know why he was at UPMC and not at the Cleveland Clinic if he was at the hospital. And he just had no memory. And he didn't know where I was. So when I walked into that emergency room, you could see all the like nurses, and they're like, oh, thank God she's here. He was so bad. So I got him out of the hospital and got him a grilled cheese at Denny's and an ice cream cone from McDonald's. That's what he wanted. And then we had to stay in the hotel there because we had to deal with the car. He totaled his car, and we had to deal with that the next day, and insurance. So
we went to look at the car, and
oh yeah.
They talked to me, they gave me the after accident report, and I clearly had gone off the edge because there were no skid marks. So whatever I was driving, that's the speed I went off the edge. The car, the front grille, everything was basically gone and laying beside it. Every airbag had deployed. They estimated, because both mirrors were ripped off and the car was basically crumpled, they estimated that I rolled it probably 2.5 times, at least 1.5 times. And when they found me, it was basically laying almost upside down there. And that's when it really hit home that I had no idea what I was doing. I mean, I have to this day, have no memory of that happening other than I remember feeling this weird, like, roller coaster jostling. That must have been when I was going over. And I remember hearing when they came to get me out of the vehicle, I was a deputy sheriff in Allegheny County and apparently had my ID with me. And I remember hearing them say, oh, he's one of us. And until she showed up, that's all I remember from the whole thing. I don't remember leaving my daughter's house. I have no
It's probably best you don't remember any of that.
So that day I became Matthew's driver. I took his keys away and he was not able to drive until he got cleared 90 days after his transplant. So, you know, for so many reasons, it's not a good idea for the patient to drive, especially with liver disease, because you can suffer, and other diseases, you can suffer hepatic encephalopathy, or you can just have weakness and your balance is off.
you're in pain, you're on meds. So I started taking Matthew in the car for his trips for treatment, appointments, trips to the ER, many trips to the ER, and pretty much everywhere. Now, though, he doesn't let me drive anywhere. Now that he's
And
given
once
up.
again, I want to apologize to her. I was not a good passenger,
It's not a good
ever.
I also became the financial aid. At the time that we were going through this, Matthew and I were engaged. We weren't married. So,
Can you believe that? Seriously.
so he took care of his bills and I took my bills. But he became so forgetful that I had to try to figure out, what he needed to pay and just do it for both of us. So, and that's a job that he has never wanted back. I got stuck with it.
Don't want it.
He's perfectly able, but I got stuck with it. It's okay.
I get my allowance every Saturday and I'm perfectly happy.
He does do the laundry though.
Oh, good.
So it's okay.
Glad to know.
And then, in our case, we lived here in Cleveland, but for those of you that live out of town, you're going to need to be a travel agent for you and your patient or family member. Yeah, yeah. Just to know where you're going to stay if you have to come here, and you have to come for evaluation, and then you're listed. It's, some organs they want you to stay in town during the listing process. So, at this point, you would need to talk to your social worker and just try to figure out places that you could stay, like the transplant house. I also was the cheerleader for Matthew. I was there for his emotional support and encouragement. And, there were a lot of times that he tried to give up and I just wouldn't let him. So it was hard, but I just kind of kept my eye on the ball and kept taking steps forward. I was also Matthew's head coach. And then I became the prison warden because he wasn't, you have to be in charge. He was not able to think straight, even though he thought he could get through this on his own. He couldn't. And I keep saying they might need more than encouragement. I had to be assertive, but I just tricked him. That's how I dealt with it. If he had a doctor's appointment and he refused to get up and go to the doctor, I'd say, no, we're not going to the doctor. We have to go to the grocery store. He loved going to the grocery store. So we would go to the grocery store and then I'd take him to or we'd go to the doctor's appointment and then I'd take him to the grocery store. But once I got him in the car, I could take him anywhere I needed him to go. It was just getting him in the car that was difficult. So then I became the expert. I knew all of Matthew's symptoms. I got to the point that I knew all of his symptoms and his issues far better than he did. And again, at times we would be in the doctor's office and he would either not be honest with the doctor on how he was feeling, or if he didn't remember from day to day the changes. So I was really there with my notebook where I would write everything down and I was able to tell the doctors what was really going on. So that was helpful because then I was able to become his advocate. You're the expert on your loved one, so you see him all the time. There were times, that I asked questions or I would point out things that I think were wrong, were going wrong. And you're the patient better than the team does, even though they know what they're doing. If you're there with them at the hospital, you can see from day to day how they're doing. So, if you don't ask, mistakes can be made, or the patient might not get the appropriate, what they need at the time, and it belongs to things. So,
Lisa, can you tell them about how Matthew knew the date in the hospital? They were asking questions to try to evaluate his mental status.
how he knew the dates?
How he would memorize it. And
Yeah,
look at
memorize
the
all
sheet.
my board.
He would memorize it from the board.
So that people would think that he was more alert and oriented than he was.
He also memorized where we lived.
Yeah.
I mean, he had everything. He would have stuff written down too.
The cheat sheet.
He had
Yeah.
cheat sheets.
So you knew, that's what I think the point is that, caregivers know their loved one, right? They know whether they're acting the way they normally would or not.
Well, so yeah, the case in point with Matthew too was after the transplant, Matthew did really well. Like he was up walking, really soon, and he was a chatterbox. He was just calling everyone and telling them how great he felt. And then a few days later, I started noticing a change in his speech pattern. where he stopped being Chatty Cathy. You know, he started answering me in one word answers. Like I'd say, "How you feeling?" He'd say, "Fine." "What'd you do today?" "Nothing." You know, I mean, he was just not himself. And I brought that to the attention of the team, and as it turned out, they thought that he was having a bad reaction to the meds he was on. So I'll never forget the surgeon coming in. I was so upset, and the surgeon coming in and telling me, "This is not my fault. This is medication related. That he was not able to talk." And I said, "You know, he fixed his liver, but what's wrong with his brain? He can't talk."
Yeah.
And he said, "No, we'll get this fixed." They had to change his medications, and then it took 5 days for him to be able to speak again. Like he couldn't talk. And he got so upset that they would give him a piece of paper and they'd ask him what he needed, and he'd say, "My wife." Call her,
Yes.
because he just needed me to get there quickly. And they would call me and say, "Please get here." You know,
Well, it speaks to the fact that encephalopathy doesn't automatically go.
No,
it doesn't.
It can take some time.
looking back, that's clearly what it was.
Yeah.
But at the time, and part of it also was that I was scared to death that it wasn't working because I was encephalopathic again, and I'm like, oh no, this can't happen. This cannot happen.
Right, now after all we've been through, so, yeah, so again, you know, monitoring his symptoms are so important, and one of the key roles for the personal caregiver is to pay close attention to the condition of the patient and changes. So having a good understanding of possible symptoms of liver disease and of all things leading up to transplant is so important for the caregivers. And even though not everybody has the same conditions that create the symptoms, some of these conditions can happen at any time. So in all cases, if you note a change in something, notify the coordinator, the doctor, or in like extreme cases, I would just take them to the ER.
And this is pre-transplant, during transplant.
Yeah, but most of the symptoms that we're going to go over for Matthew were his pre-transplant symptoms. So Matthew at the time was very jaundiced when he was sick. He had kind of a yellowish green color of his skin, and his eyes were really yellow. And that's caused by the buildup of bilirubin in this case. And I will tell you that that's the quickest symptom to have gone away after his surgery, which was like 14 hours long. And then I was able to see him. He was asleep, so I couldn't see the whites of his eyes, but I could see that his skin looked different when I saw him about 16 hours after his surgery. And then the next morning, they said to go home, get some rest, and if he was better, that they'd be able to wake him up. And by the time I got there, they had already woken him up because he did so well. They'd handed him his cell phone, and he was trying to call me to say, "Where are you? I'm awake." And I saw the whites of his eyes, and they were completely, perfectly white and clear. So it was crazy. Matthew also had ascites, which is abdominal swelling due to fluid retention. And he had to have a process called paracentesis done so often. We had a standing order.
We had season tickets.
Yeah, we were there every Friday. I knew all the nurses, their names, the kids, everybody, because we were there so much. The first time they did it, was so scary. I remember, putting the needle in. They got 11 liters of fluid out of his abdomen the first time. And then it kind of became normal. It's like, okay, it's Friday, let's go. And they get 5 liters or 6 liters or 8 liters. It just kind of depended. And so they're often told to, the patients have to follow a low sodium diet because that will help with the fluid retention, which is 2,000 milligrams of sodium or less a day, which is, if you start looking at labels of stuff, that you can't eat anything. Like, you can't eat anything. Not a can of soup, no lunch meat. No, I mean, everything has so much sodium in it. So I started doing things like, boiling chickens and making my own chicken broth without sodium, and just really doing a lot more cooking and making sure he wasn't eating sodium. Matthew also had pleural effusion, which is that same fluid retention, but in the chest cavity, which is really scary because he had to have, I guess, fluid withdrawn 3 times in a very short time period of 10 days. By a process called thoracentesis, where they literally go into the ribs and get the fluid out.
Yeah.
And I remember one day he woke up and he just could not breathe. He couldn't breathe. And I took him to the emergency room, and they ended up finding out they took 5 liters out of his chest cavity.
Yeah, they told me when they started the procedure that they typically get 1 or 1.5. and they did wine. And then they got, well, they had a 2-liter bottle. They filled it, and the guy goes, "We better get another bottle." And they got another one, and then he's like, "Oh my, we have to get another bottle." So they got 5 liters out of the chest.
So, and this, again, the ascites, and he did not, after his surgery, he did not have to have another thoracentesis or another paracentesis. I understand that sometimes after, it's possible that there might need to be some drainage, but in Matthew's case, it didn't happen. He also had edema, which is just general lower body swelling due to fluid retention, and it's often treated with Lasix. But they have to be very careful with Lasix because it can cause kidney failure. And so, you know, it was hard because, I mean, his legs, we would call them tree trunks, and they'd make him put these pantyhose on. Remember how every morning it took him 20 minutes to get those things on because he couldn't do it himself. And so that impacted his mobility and his balance. And and the edema took a long time to go away relatively. It was like 6 weeks, I think.
And sometimes it
little
can
by
be
little.
months.
Yeah, it was little by little, but it kind of went, So I'll remember it was in June. So your surgery was in April, and it was a hot day in June when he could finally get his cowboy boots on for the first time. And it didn't matter that it was like 90 degrees on. He was going to wear his cowboy boots. I just made sure he had jeans and a shirt on. And then, Matthew was always itchy when he was sick, so it was really extreme.
We're talking like break the skin, bleeding.
Couldn't sleep, itchy.
Yeah.
So I talked to the doctors about that, and they said that that's a real symptom. They did prescribe some topical steroid ointment, I think, for it, and I guess that helped a little bit. But he also had restless leg syndrome, which he had never had before and hasn't had it since. He could not sleep. His legs were restless. They told him that there's really nothing that they could do about that. Just to get up, if you feel like you need to walk, get up and walk, because they want you to get exercise. So he'd be like standing at the base of the bed and like marching because he couldn't sleep. He had muscle cramps that were horrific. They would wake him up in the middle of the night. They were so extreme. And
Couldn't walk.
He couldn't walk. He couldn't walk them off. The doctors did prescribe something for those. I don't remember, but they did. I don't remember what it was, but they told him to drink diet tonic water because there's quinine in it, which they can't prescribe, but they said drink just an 8-ounce glass every night, and they wanted it to be the no sugar kind, and apparently it doesn't have a lot of sodium. So they had him drink that, and that helped maybe a little bit to take the edge off. But and the muscle cramps went away right after his surgery too. He didn't really have another cramp after that. When Matthew was sick, he had a lot of muscle mass wasting. So he always has worked out. So I noticed after his surgery that his arms were much thinner. Also, after the swelling went down in his legs, I realized how much muscle mass he had lost in his legs. And that can make the patient feel weaker, and your mobility is impacted. Some people have a hard time then being able to walk again because they've lost so much muscle mass. So that took a while to get back. I mean, he was mobile in that he walked in for his surgery. I mean, he wasn't really mobile, but he wasn't in a wheelchair. So he was able to walk, but again, his balance was not great. So he started little by little with the stretchy bands that
I was obsessive
physical
about the
therapist.
stretchy bands.
Yeah, physical
I
therapist.
had my booklet, and every day I did exactly what it said to do. But it still took probably 9 months to 12 months until I felt I was starting to rebuild something.
Yeah.
Oh,
Matthew also had esophageal varices, and these are enlarged veins in the esophagus, and it's caused by liver disease. These can rupture and cause bleeding, which is very serious. So they found these on a scope, routine scope for him, and so they did not. Luckily, they did not rupture for him. They banded them, and that kept them intact. And the funny thing was, it was about maybe a year after your transplant, they went in for just a follow-up endoscopy, and they said that all of those varices were gone. Everything was back to normal after his surgery. And then through this whole thing, Matthew was tired all the time. He never felt rested. He wasn't sleeping well. We were under a lot of stress, and a lot of the symptoms he was experiencing woke him up at night. So,
I don't like sleep.
yeah, yes. Next slide. Okay. And,
sorry.
and then the last symptom we're going to talk about is encephalopathy, hepatic encephalopathy.
It takes about 3 months to learn how to say that, so don't.
It can appear as confusion, forgetfulness, or a kind of a fogginess. Some people have trouble forming sentences and have difficulty communicating or finding words. The patient can become very irritable,
Not me, I was-
or their speech will become slurred, and they get disoriented and lost and sleepy. They could get lost driving like Matthew did, or much worse. So it can happen at any time, and it is very dangerous. This is caused by high ammonia levels in the bloodstream due to the damaged liver. And if this happens, you immediately need to call the transplant coordinator, go see your doctor, or just go to the ER if you're worried. The treatment for it is lactulose. It's this wonderful, icky, sticky drink that just looks horrible, so I can't even imagine how it tastes.
To this day, I won't eat pancakes or anything with syrup on it because the syrup reminds me of lactose.
Yes.
I won't do it.
So it basically is a laxative. It binds the ammonia and then it gets flushed out that way. So if it is prescribed, it's very important that you don't skip doses and just make sure you take it on time. And this, again, hepatic encephalopathy affects many patients before transplant, but it could linger for a few days or a few weeks after transplant. So, we came up with this caregiver checklist to help caregivers feel prepared and how to start now. So no matter what phase of transplant you're in right now, no matter what organ or what part of the journey you're on, this should help you. So firstly, find out who your coordinator is. You'll start with a pre-transplant coordinator, and then at some point, if you're in the hospital and being transplanted, you'll have a separate hospital nurse coordinator. And then after you're released, you'll have a post-transplant coordinator. And this is the nurse coordinator that is your manager, that they answer all of your questions. They're the ones that tell you what you can and can't eat, what meds or vitamins you can and can't take, and all sorts of things. So if anything happens, we call Jim, our coordinator, right away. Find out who your social worker is. They know how to reach them. They're the ones that help you, as Annette did with us, manage through
social worker.
manage through this journey from a different perspective. Well, if it weren't for Annette, we never would have thought of going to the VA when we were having financial difficulties, because it just wasn't in our radar. We just didn't even know that was a possibility. Establish a secondary personal caregiver. It's kind of your line of relief. Get them involved now. So, if you have maybe a child that's going to help, or you have an aunt or uncle or just a friend that's going to be your backup, start getting them involved so that they know, you might need extra help with grocery shopping, or you might need someone to drive the patient somewhere, or whatever it is. Try to take some of that burden off of you now, because it's going to be a long haul. It can be anyway. Create a chain of communication to keep people updated. So after Matthew's little trip on the turnpike, I freaked out, and I needed to know where everyone in my life was at all times. So, and I wanted to be able to update people on what was going on. So it was very helpful for me we had Life 360 or something like that, where we used, I just needed to know where everyone was so that I could get a hold of them if something were to happen. And granted, Matthew was in and out of the hospital a lot. We had dry runs. There were lots of things going on that I had to, I would call one person and they could kind of have a tree of telling everyone else what to do and what was going on. I remember even with work, my students were great, because one of my students said, hey, just give me your email list, and when the transplant happens, I'll let everyone know, and I'll let them know you'll be off, no lessons until you call them. So that was helpful. Inform work, both your personal caregiver's work and the patient's work, as to what is going on and what may happen, that at the drop of a hat, the patient's going to have to go in the hospital because he's sick, or that you get called in for transplant and you're not going to be able to be there. Learn your insurance benefits and resources, including medication coverage. That's so important, whether it be for private insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, and VA options.
Explore all of them.
Yeah, anything you can, that's right. Create and update a medication list and take it with you everywhere. So this is really important that you know and have record of what the patient is taking at any given time, because before Matthew's transplant and before he was really, really sick, we were still trying to go to family functions and things out of town. And every time Matthew got on a plane, we didn't realize it, we would get to wherever, Milwaukee or Arizona, wherever we were, he would go immediately in the hospital because he'd be encephalopathic. We found out later that
By the way, I
air
should have known
travel.
this, yeah, because when you go
nobody told
on a
us.
commercial airliner, it's at 6,000 feet, and one of the things that can really induce hepatic and brain swelling, which is what it is the fact that pressure change. So I was basically self-inducing
Yeah.
by getting on there.
So we would be in a strange place and not a system that would talk to the Cleveland Clinic, and they had no idea what Matthew was taking. So I would just open his My Chart and I would give them permission to look at all of his tests and everything. So that was very easy for us to do that. With smartphones now, it's easy. Develop your low sodium food ingredient plan. I learned that balsamic vinegar has no sodium, and I would put that in everything, on everything. Yeah, create a list of the patient's overall appearance and demeanor and monitor it. Understand their driving rules. They shouldn't be driving, and develop transportation plans for them. Oh, consider, this is the Life 360. Consider putting a monitoring app on their phone if they have confusion. So not only did I slap that on Matthew's phone, I had it on everyone's phone. His mother, his kids, my kids, everyone knew I was spying on them, but because you have to opt in to do it. But I just needed to know where everyone was. You know, my son was in college. I needed to know if he was at his dorm or if he was in class. So that worked well for me. Develop a go dark plan. So you need a plan because there will be times at pre-transplant or when the transplant happens that you need to be able to leave the house, the kids, the pets. You need to make sure the bills are being paid, even though you're, freaking out at the hospital with the patient. Your plans are going to change. You're just going to need to be there for the patient. So some of the things that I did is I put all the bills on auto pay. We had hired someone who knew how to walk and feed our dogs. So I would call Damon, our dog walker, and say, we're in the hospital, take care of the gang until I let you know, until I text you. And so that was taken care of. Basically my son was in DC in college and I needed help. So he transferred to John Carroll to finish his degree there so he could be closer. So those are the types of things that we did to sort of, to get some control.
So is that what you mean by go dark?
Yeah, you're going to have to go dark. So you're going to need everything in place and
Kind of off the radar.
Off the radar, yeah.
So, but life has to continue. So you got to make sure that's
Make sure stuff gets done.
good.
Yeah. Understand that you can have a dry run and the patient not receive the transplant even if you're called in. So prepare yourself and the patient for that. And there's not a whole lot you can do to prepare yourself because until it happens to you, it's an incredible experience actually. And we had 4 dry runs. We held the record for a long time. But on the 4th dry run, Matthew decided he was going to just
The fourth,
chuck it all in.
the fourth dry run for me was probably one of the worst things that emotionally has ever happened to me because at that point, I don't know, my meld was hovering in the low 30s. I was in the hospital, it seemed constantly. We got the call, we came in, we were there for 12 hours.
Yeah, something like that.
Kept telling me, in fact, they did the antimicrobial bath, they were prepping me,
Ready to go.
ready to go, and then Dr. Kelly had to come into the room and tell us that they didn't think the liver was healthy enough to be transplanted. Now, the most important thing I'm going to say in all of this is, if they don't think the liver is healthy enough, you don't think the liver is healthy.
You don't want
You
it.
don't want the liver or any organ that the surgeon decide is not healthy enough to transplant. But emotionally, that was just absolutely crushing for me. And we went home, and at that point is when I was taking, 33 things a day between lactulose and all the different meds and everything. And I said to Lisa, I said, you know what? I'm just going to stop taking everything, and I'll either die or they'll have to give me a liver.
And I said, no, that's not what we're going to do. You're going to do exactly as I say. Here's your meds, and we're just going to keep focusing. It's going to happen. It just wasn't the right time. It wasn't the right one.
When the 5th phone call came, I didn't even want to answer the phone.
No.
Like, I handed the phone to her and I said, you decide. We'll go, we won't go, decline it, accept it. I'm done in this decision. So fortunate, and that was a really unfair thing to do at that point, because we hadn't really had that conversation of what did I want to accept in terms of, you know, the liver and anything they would say about it, or, you know, you think that about any organ. So, you know, I urge everyone, have that conversation up front. Make sure that your personal caregivers are, you know, knowledgeable and, you know, have the power to be able to say, yes, we accept it or we don't, because you may be in a situation where you can't make that decision depending upon what's going on with you, or you don't want to. But I was,
You couldn't.
at that point, I was distraught. I was so depressed and just done.
Yeah.
So
Needless to say, I accepted the organ,
I appreciate that.
and I got him in the car, and I got him to the hospital. I was like, you're not quitting on me now.
You asked what's wrong.
Oh, yeah, because I remember asking, what's wrong with the liver? Because normally there in an organ, there's something. It could be, you know, drug use or incarceration. One time, one of the livers tested positive for syphilis, but they can fix that. So I seconded that one, but I said, so what's wrong with this one? And they said, absolutely nothing. It's perfectly healthy. 19-year-old. Bless, you know, God bless his family. But also, this is really important. Develop a go to the hospital kit. So I got really good at this after 4 dry runs. I had this bag, and it had an extra phone charger. It had my small tablet. I didn't want to bring my computer. It had magazines in it. It had snacks because the call never comes at like 1 PM. There's no food in the middle of the night. We would be there at 1 AM, and I'd want something to eat. What else did it have in it? Yeah, just magazines and stuff. But and clothes. I wanted clothes for myself and just a couple things for him. And then eventually, once I had a picture.
Yeah.
You wanted a picture with you all the time of us dancing or something. So, okay, so get that ready and just have it so that when you get the call, you can get into the hospital book. And then reach out for help because help is available. Try to take care of yourself as the caregiver. You're not going to be able to help the patient if you're not healthy. So try to keep up with your own medical dental needs. I remember that I put off seeing a dentist for 1.5 years because every time I had an appointment, he was in the hospital and I couldn't leave him. You know, I didn't realize that until I finally got to the dentist, and they're like, "Where have you been?" But I was also really good. You know, my doctors were all pretty good at when I had an appointment and I had to cancel last minute. They knew why. So, and if you're interested in talking further with a volunteer, like a patient who's gone through a transplant or a caregiver, talk to your social worker or talk to Annette here. We might not have the same story, but living through a transplant is unlike anything else as a personal caregiver and as a patient. So I always say that the stories aren't the same, but the scars are very similar. We don't have the same scars that the patients have, but they're a little different. And then hopefully a lot of you know about the Transplant House. It's a wonderful place to stay if you have to come into town for evaluations and for transplant. So the number is up there. You all have the website.
Social workers.
Yes.
Lots of programs.
Lots of programming, so that's all great. Oh, and here are just some before and after pictures of Matthew. Gosh, I haven't seen these for a while. So the pictures, the ones on the left are Matthew at various stages at the hospital. I remember one of those. I don't remember. Oh, the second picture in was, I think that was in Arizona. Weren't we in Arizona?
No, that was just my mom's.
Oh, okay. Well, one of them's from Arizona. When he was sick, we were traveling. We landed there. The one at the bottom, we were in the ER, and it was Super Bowl Sunday, and he wouldn't go to the hospital unless I told him we could bring his computer and he could watch the Super Bowl. Yeah. So there we were for most of the game. And then on the right, okay, so the picture on top is Yeah, Matthew, part of his therapy after being out of the hospital after his transplant was dancing, because I'm a professional ballroom dancer. And as a caregiver, you can't leave them alone after their transplant. So I would always take Matthew with me to work. And it was exactly 4 weeks to the day. It was on May 13th. I said to him, bring some shoes you can dance in. You're going to dance today. He's like, I can't dance. I just had a liver transplant. And I said, well, I'll put some music on. We'll walk around. What the heck? You'll get some exercise. So we did a half hour. He did about a half hour of a waltz that day. But yeah, about 30 minutes. No, 15 minutes only.
15
But then
minutes.
every day we added on another 5 minutes. So he got built up to a half hour every day of dancing, just the slow dances. So that picture on top is a competition that was us doing the tango in a competition 9 weeks and 4 days after his transplant.
Which is very unusual.
It's highly unlikely. It was so unusual that when I showed the picture, the next week we went for his 10-week visit and we showed your surgeon the picture. And he said, oh, is that from before you got sick? And Matthew said, no, it was last Saturday. I did 12 dances. I got all first places. And the look on his face, he said, send me that picture. So I emailed him the picture and he sent it back home to his parents in Japan to show them what good work he does. Yeah.
I always love that picture, but I always want to say it's very unusual.
Yeah, very unusual.
That's not normal.
No, it's not. It's not
It's not
normal.
I've never been accused of being wrong.
Yeah, that's true.
This is true.
Some other things